First and foremost, Yat'e, She'e Heather Fleming Inishya, and I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and also the executive director at Change Labs in Tuba City. Bit'ane Nishle, Bilagana Bashichin, Todachini Dashiche, Ado Bilagana Deshanella. And thank you all for joining us for our fourth discussion in our four-part series titled Doing Business on the Navajo Nation. Today's webinar is focused on small business growth, specifically what it takes to grow a small business on the Navajo Nation. And as I mentioned, there were 3 webinars before this that anybody can check out up on the Change Labs YouTube channel. The first one was focused on starting a business on Navajo and what that takes. The second one was focused on the issue of accessing land, dealing with construction permits, and what was the third topic? Oh, accessing electricity for a business. And then last week's discussion was focused on the credit environment on Navajo, asking the question, what could a Navajo banking system look like? So before we start, I wanted to give you a quick introduction to Change Labs for everybody on the call today who's not familiar with our organization. We're based in Tuba City, Arizona, and we serve Navajo, Hopi, but we also have entrepreneurs from White Mountain Apache and Pueblo communities participating in our programs. There are a couple things that we do at Change Labs, but primarily our goal, our mission is to provide creative workspace, tools, resources, and knowledge for Native entrepreneurs across the Southwest. And we have 5 programs to achieve it. I'm going to step through a few of them right now to give you a high-level introduction. So first and foremost, I wanted all of you to know that we have an in-house resident designer. And what that means for each of you is if any of you need support with marketing, let's say you're building a website, you're trying to transition online, or you're contemplating a new logo for your business or the first logo for a business, signage, flyers, social media content, whatever it may be, Mariah Ashley is our in-house resident designer this year. She's a Navajo designer out of Flagstaff, and she hosts open studio hours twice a month, virtual open studio hours. So if you want to set up an appointment with her to talk about how to build a website, how to create a logo, anybody in the community can sign up at nativestartup.org/events. She's there for you to support your marketing needs. And secondly, we also offer co-working space in Tuba City. We have a little studio behind the Denny's in town, and it's open to the public. It's free to use. We are open, Marsha just changed our hours. I want to say 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Navajo time, but if Marsha's on the call and she wants to correct me, please just let me know in the chat window and I can update everybody. Please wear your mask. We have Wi-Fi. We can offer you desk space. We also have color printing and copying, and we have a few marketing tools that you can use there, like a button maker, a Cricut machine. Marsha says 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Navajo time. Apologize, Marsha. You're welcome to come in and see Marsha at our co-working space. I would say that Change Labs is most known for our business incubator. So every year we select 20 high potential Native American entrepreneurs to enroll in this program. And every entrepreneur enrolled is paired with coaches, with resources. They do a lot of peer training and development, access to mentors. And when you graduate from the program, you're also eligible to apply for a $10,000 loan through our microloan program, Kinship Lending. So today, this is a 90-minute session. And these first 30 minutes, we're going to step through the research and the findings from Change Labs and Causal Design's report, Doing Business on the Navajo Nation. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the barriers to small business growth. And even more specifically, we're going to be looking at Navajo Nation business tax payments and also enforcing contracts. And then once my colleague Hannah presents that material, we'll leave a few minutes at the end there if people have questions about any of the data before we transition to the next 30 minutes, which is a moderated discussion between 2 wonderful Navajo entrepreneurs we have joining us today that have direct experience with the issues that we'll be talking about related to our research findings. And then at the very end, we'll open it up to our audience to ask questions, to share their own stories, or to give feedback on the content that was shared today. And with that, Change Labs has a YouTube channel. If you just Google Change Labs YouTube Change Labs, hopefully it'll show up there. If not, I will send out a link and post it in our chat window. But if you want to catch up on the videos from earlier in this series, they're all up there. And we welcome your feedback and welcome your input on this research that we're conducting and the questions that we're asking this audience about how we improve the business regulatory environment on Navajo. And now I want to hand it over to our partners at Causal Design. And I'm going to cue it up just a little bit to say that Causal Design is a separate organization than Change Labs that we've been collaborating with for years now. They help Change Labs understand our impact and understand, help us make adjustments to our programs so that we can better serve our community. And they're also our close collaborators and basically the lead on a lot of this research doing business on the Navajo Nation. So I'd like to introduce you to Raymar and Hannah from Causal Design, and I'll let them take it over from here.
Thank you so much, Heather. My name is Raymar Macaranis, and I'm the co-founder of Causal Design. As Heather mentioned, right, we've been working with Change Labs to really work to figure out and both measure and understand their impact on the small business community. It's been a pleasure working with them these past years, and Hannah will dive into a little bit more around how this relationship has worked. Today's installment, it's final in the series, but not final in the sense of the work and engagement that we're doing with Change Labs and trying to help figure out how we improve the business environment on the nation. Today's discussion is going to revolve around a range of issues facing Native entrepreneurs as they try to grow their business, and Hannah is going to share the findings of her report. But just as important, we'll have some time today to have a discussion with our panelists and to talk about then how does this data that we found, how does that play out in sort of the day-to-day lives and the reality of people who are starting a business. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Hannah to dive into some of her main findings.
Thanks, Raymar. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Pruitt. I'm a research analyst at Causal Design. I've been working with Causal for a little over a year now. And for about that entire year, I've been working directly with Change Labs. But Change Labs' work on Navajo Nation spans far further than that. For the last 6 years, they've been working directly with Navajo and Native entrepreneurs, specifically on tribal lands. And over the course of this work, they've collected a lot of stories or anecdotes about what business owners find challenging or what is difficult for them to start and grow their businesses on Navajo Nation. And after years of collecting these stories, they asked the question, what exactly makes doing business on Navajo Nation so difficult? And they brought that question to us at Causal Design, and we proposed to answer it with something called the Doing Business methodology. So Doing Business is a report done by the World Bank for about the last 20 years. They've completed it annually in over 190 countries across the globe. But at its core, Doing Business is really a tool to try to understand all of the different factors that a business owner would need to consider whenever they are starting or growing and operating a business. So what exactly does Doing Business measure? The way that it measures a business environment is it takes a hypothetical business or a case study business, and it has this business move through all of the different processes or different steps that any business would need to do to start and operate and grow. So this starts with opening a business. For example, with starting a business, it looks at how would this hypothetical business get registered and incorporate, how would they open their tax accounts, how would they get their proper insurance regimes, and it measures all of the different steps and time that would take. It looks at getting a location. So how would this business access land? How would they build a structure on that land? And once they build it, how would they get it connected to electricity to have a spot to be able to operate their business? It looks at accessing finance and analyzes the credit environment. So how easy it might be for this business to access credit. And lastly, it looks at completing day-to-day operations. In this case, we look at tax payments. And how can this business be sure that they are operating in a secure environment? So if they issue a contract, how easy is it for them to enforce this contract? And it looks at all 8 of these different indicators through 4 different lenses. The first of which is complexity. So it looks at how many different steps would this business need to go through in order to pay their taxes, for example. And it looks at time. So how many days would it take to complete this process? It looks at the monetary cost of completing these processes. So how much would this business need to pay in permits or in fees? And lastly, it looks at the quality of regulation for each of these indicator sets. So what this lens tries to get at is if we have a number of regulations that we know are supportive of a business and make it easier to do business, it really just tries to benchmark if this type of regulation is in place or if it's not. And together, we think that this builds into the business environment, or all of the different things that a business owner would need to think about or contend with in order to start their business and grow and operate it. And today, as we have alluded, we're going to be focusing specifically on dealing with day-to-day operations and operating in a secure business environment. So where did we complete this analysis? So we knew that we wanted to benchmark these processes and look at each aspect of the business environment on Navajo Nation. And we did that in Tuba City, where Change Labs is located. And we also did it in Shiprock so that we could get a picture of a different chapter in a different state system. But where we thought we might glean the most insight is if we were able to compare the business environment on Navajo Nation to a border town. So if you have the same exact business in Shiprock trying to pay their taxes, how much easier or more difficult might it be for that exact same type of business to be able to do that exact same thing in Cortez, for example? So with that very quick overview of the methodology, I'd like to dive straight into our findings. So starting with paying taxes. We found that the total tax burden on Navajo is actually lower than in Cortez. Generally, taxes or businesses pay a fewer number of taxes, and the tax rates tend to be lower. However, despite the fact that there are fewer taxes, it still takes longer to pay your taxes on Navajo as compared to in Cortez. And a lot of this is due to the fact that you can't set up tax accounts and pay your taxes online on Navajo. You either have to mail them in or go in person. And there's also a higher frequency of payment. So just to get a little bit more into the weeds on this, if you've been in my previous presentations, you'll recognize these guys. On the left, we have Nick, who owns a screen printing shop in Shiprock, and he is our case study business for this presentation. And then on the right, we have an entrepreneur in Cortez who operates a identical screen printing shop in a border town. And if they were going to pay their business taxes, this is the list of taxes that Nick would need to pay. He would have to pay his Navajo sales tax on all of the screen prints that he sells, and he has the possessory interest tax on his business site lease. Whereas the Cortez entrepreneur has a number of different taxes at the city, state, and federal level. And how often they need to pay their taxes. So Nick over in Shiprock, on average, has to file these taxes 3 times per year across these two. So that means 3 times per year he has to prepare his taxes, drive over to Window Rock, or go to a post office and mail in his taxes. Whereas in Cortez, that screen printing shop only has to do this once per year. And as I've alluded, On Navajo, you're either mailing your taxes in or you're driving over to Window Rock, whereas in Cortez, it can all be done online, generally through one single portal called My Biz Colorado, where this screen printing shop can log in and pay all of their taxes automatically. And so with that, we'll move over into enforcing contracts. This looks at a commercial dispute resolution in both on Navajo and in Cortez. And we found that resolving a commercial dispute on Navajo takes almost 2 full years from the filing phase to enforcement. And the time that this trial takes often makes it quite expensive, especially with respect to attorney fees. It ends up being about 85% of the claim value. So to put this in perspective, if we have Nick again, who's in Shiprock, and Nick issues a contract worth $30,000 for screen prints for a commercial buyer. So someone comes to him and says, I would love for you to make me a bunch of screen prints, and once you do, I'll pay you $30,000. And he's really excited, and he delivers all of his screen prints on time. And once he brings his screen prints to the buyer says, these actually aren't of the sufficient quality that I expected, and I refuse to pay the $30,000 that I originally promised you. And so this leaves Nick in a pretty tough situation in which he has 2 options. He can either eat the cost of producing those screen prints and try to resell them, which might be quite difficult considering he printed them specifically for this certain buyer. Or he can try to enforce the contract through the judicial system and force the buyer to honor this contract. And for this presentation, let's say he opts for the latter. And whenever he begins this process, you can map it out through 3 phases. The first is filing and service, where you're going to the court, you're filing this commercial dispute, and on average, this takes about 38 days on Navajo. Next is the trial and judgment phase, where there's hearings. We hear from an expert witness about screen print quality and if this is of sufficient quality. And both lawyers are able to litigate their cases, and it takes about 600 days. And lastly, the judge rules in Nick's favor and says that the buyer must pay the $30,000 to him. And there's the enforcement phase, which sees that this is truly enforced, and it takes about 75 days on Navajo. And what was really startling or really crazy to me when I was completing this research is this 600-day trial and judgment period for this commercial dispute. And perhaps one of our guests could speak to this more later, but this, I think, is the phase where the attorney will be most involved, where they're going through the briefs, where they're going to the hearings, where they're litigating, and where they rack up the most amount of hours spent on a case. And this correlates directly to the amount of attorney fees that they charge. So for 600, or for the total trial, but most of it comes from the 600 days, the attorney fees would be about $26,000. The court fees are pretty minimal. It's about $525. And Navajo Nation has no enforcement fees or no fees that you would have to charge in order to have the ruling enforced. But in total, this ends up being $26,525 that Nick has to pay in order to get his $30,000 contract paid out. So he spends 2 full years to recoup, only 14% of his original claim. So he spends 86% of it litigating and enforcing this contract. And while it costs 86% of the claim value to enforce this contract on Navajo, I had mentioned that the World Bank completes this analysis in countries across the globe, one of which being the broader United States, where it costs an estimated about 30.5% in other US cities to enforce a contract. And we're also able to draw this out or extrapolate it out into a global scale and look at those. If this exact business had to enforce this exact contract in 190 countries across the world, how easy might it be in those 190 different countries? So the first of which is Singapore, where It's really cheap and it's really fast to enforce contracts. They have a small claims court that this will qualify for to be enforced really quickly. The United States comes at rank number 17. The DRC comes in at rank number 178, and Navajo Nation's right behind them at rank 179. And so you can see that it's quite difficult. Navajo Nation ranks in the bottom 15% of the global stage in terms of how easy it might be to enforce contracts. And this can be really prohibitive for businesses. Not only does it make it difficult for them to recoup these investments, it also serves as a disincentive, or it makes businesses less hesitant to enter into contracts with people they don't know if they're not sure that their contracts can be enforced in a timely and costly manner. So we took these findings and collected all the data, did the analysis, and we came out with a couple of recommendations that we thought might make it easier for businesses to do these type of activities on Navajo Nation. And we categorized these recommendations into the short term, so things that we think that Change Labs or their partners could do, tomorrow or next week in order to make it easier to pay your taxes or to enforce contracts on Navajo Nation, and into the longer term. So what are some strategic policy goals or longer term things that would make this business environment better? So for contract enforcement, in the near term, we found that a lot of the attorney fees are derived directly from how long it takes to enforce this contract. And if businesses were able to instead do some of this through self-representation, it would drastically decrease the amount of money that they would need to invest in contract enforcement. So we suggested that Change Labs could put together a self-representation guide to guide businesses through kind of standard commercial disputes like this. And in the longer term, Change Labs and ESOs can, or entrepreneurial support organizations, can work with the tribal court system in order to, be a voice for the business community on Navajo to advocate for judicial improvements that might lower the amount of time that businesses need to spend in order to enforce their contracts, and in turn, the implicit cost burden that it ends up being. So some of these reforms that have been successful in other countries might be, stricter time limits on the amount of time it takes to schedule hearings and issue judgment, and incentives to adhere to these time limits, such as sanctions or, lower court fees for the plaintiff or the defendant, and if they're not adhered to, and maybe also allocating more resources to the tribal court system so that there are more judges and clerks able to handle these cases. Next, looking at paying taxes. In the near term, Change Labs has this really awesome resource called Build Navajo, which has the process for getting your business incorporated and set up on Navajo Nation, and also talks a little bit about tax compliance. And we thought in the near term, this could be really built out into an even broader resource for Navajo businesses to have all the different forms that they might need and guidance on where and when to file them. And in the longer term, we think that Build Navajo or something similar to it could be built into a tribal system where you're able to go online and pay your taxes to try and decrease the amount of time or the burden that this places on entrepreneurs. And in this kind of new normal era, or this post-COVID era, we think that this is also going to be a really important resource for businesses. So I just kind of flew through that, but I will stop there and open it up to the audience for any questions specific to the data or some of our recommendations and the research itself. So thank you, everyone.
Hi, Hannah. Were you able to find out like how much money is lost on the Navajo Nation due to this litigation process?
No, I wasn't able to extrapolate it out into something like that. In other research that I've found, if you think about it in terms of business loss just generally, there's a number out there that about 65% of the money that is earned or like that is earned on Navajo Nation is actually spent outside of it in border towns. So I think that might be the closest metric to something like that. But there's nothing, I guess, specific to the judicial system.
It's a little bit difficult to sort of pick out, right? Because there's kind of two sides of the coin. This is Raymar, by the way. The two sides of the coin to that, right? So there's the actual litigation costs that that a business would have to pay for, and that can be, you can figure out what the figures are there and add those up. Then the other side of it is how much, I guess, contract enforcement is just not happening, right? So people are probably not even bothering to bring these claims to the court because of how prohibitively slow or expensive it might be. And it would be really difficult to kind of capture, well, what is the loss happening because, right, there's an inefficient process in place, or a process that is difficult for regular people to engage with. And so we can try to look at other means if we had maybe data on things like alternative ways of settling dispute, but I don't think that's available in the nation right now, right? So in other structures, you might have mediation services, other types of negotiators who might engage when you don't have a legal process in place. But again, I don't think we have access to that information.
Heather, this is Cheryl Lee. This was done in the state of Colorado. Have you looked at other states and see different comparisons in terms of taxes? I know you had the two columns and the two different numbers, so I was just wondering if that was something that you'd be willing to or have looked into.
Yeah. So I didn't look, or there haven't been this exact analysis done in the states that surround Navajo. So in New Mexico or Arizona or Utah. However, this analysis is done in two different cities in the US. So in New York and in LA, which I think are maybe not the best comparison since they're very different, just being urban centers. But the same kind of through line exists that generally taxes are much higher outside of Navajo, but much easier to pay in terms of how long it takes to prepare them and because of the frequency of payments, or how long it takes to file them because of an online infrastructure to be able to do so.
And a little bit of background there too, right? So this first year was really meant to be kind of a proof of concept for us. We wanted to see whether or not it was doable to apply this methodology to the Navajo Nation, whether or not we'd be able to get all the data we needed, get access to some of this information. And once we did, we could then decide, okay, so for future years, does it make sense to expand this, right? Do we need more comparator cities that represent each of the states? Would that be really interesting? Or should we focus on specific sectors and how those might be impacted by each of these different sets of regulations? And so that's still something that we're trying to figure out what the best path is for, but we do have some good ideas on our end. But if you have any thoughts or recommendations there, we're also very eager to hear them.
I'm just going to add that this is usually the point where somebody asks if we compared to other tribal nations, and the answer is no. And to our knowledge, this is the first time this methodology has been applied to a tribal community in the United States. So Navajo Nation would be the only tribal nation that's been measured using this methodology. Are there any other questions for Hannah and Raymar about the data? All right then, I am going to segue to our invited guests. But before I go there, one thing that we want to highlight in today's conversation is that there are more daily constraints to operating a business on the Navajo Nation that entrepreneurs have to contend with. So contract enforcement is a big one. And we have two guests today who will speak to this experience and shed light on the challenge. But in addition to contract enforcement and tax payments, a big disruptor to day-to-day operations is also just the lack of internet connectivity. And in the wake of COVID, you see a lot of small businesses pivoting online or using the internet to access resources, but that's not always an option on the res. So imagine trying to grow your business without any online presence. One of our guests today was invited to share her story of how she left her homeland on Navajo in favor of a border town because her business is 100% dependent on internet connectivity. And then finally, for those of you who are in our very first webinar in this series, we talked about the lack of physical addresses, making it difficult to acquire an employment identification number when you're starting a business. So the lack of physical addresses impacts many other aspects related to business growth. For example, it makes getting packages delivered to your door nearly impossible. It makes securing general liability and other common business insurance policies nearly impossible. And if you don't have liability insurance, it then becomes difficult to even secure client contracts in the first place. So the lack of labeled roads, internet connectivity, the opaque legal environment, and the hassle of having to drive around the reservation to stay compliant prohibits growth of nearly any business that is based on the reservation. So with us today to share their insights on this challenge is Sherilee Francis. Sherilee is an award-winning video production specialist and owner of CF Productions in Flagstaff, and she's also the interim executive director of the Native Women Entrepreneurs of Arizona. And we also have Mr. Colin Bradley, who's the owner of Colin Bradley Law down in Phoenix, and also a former attorney with the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. So thank you guys both for joining us today. And Sherilee, I wanted to start with you. So you used to run your business in Tuba City, where Change Labs is located, but now you're based in Flagstaff. And looking at your own experience, does the research that Hannah shared line up with what you went through in terms of growing your production business?
Really looking at the data. First of all, for this invitation. A quick introduction. Jay Sherilee Francis Yanishia. Hashkanat on Inchlan. Do nash ajatka baham bashis chi ado kitchini dashanella. Do osli biage nasha akut ego stanan Inchlan. The data that is presented today is very important. It's so important to have data to start with. So thanks to Change Labs and any efforts of people trying to understand what data means and why that's important, that's where we need to start with the Navajo Nation. What it means to do business, or what it takes to grow a business on the Navajo Nation. It includes, of course, all of these elements, but in reality, it does not work that way. We could go A, B, C, D, E, F, G and try to do a checklist, but that's not how it works. And the reason that is so is we have to look back into our history as Navajo people. There is so much history that the Navajo people have to really go back and understand. And right now, particularly during this pandemic, there has to be a need and a push from the people themselves to be visionaries, to see what they see for Navajo Nation in, say, 20 years. You cannot rely on anybody else to make those decisions or say someone else is going to do it. You have to get up and do it now. The Navajo people, if you've not done it, start researching. Right now in 2020, we have so much available technology and information that is available through your iPhones, your computers, everywhere. It's so free. You can go to YouTube and check out past speeches from people. It's amazing what you learn. Most recently, I got reminded to watch a video by our past chairman, Peter McDonald, an interview he gave at San Juan College about 2 years ago. Even that type of information, he talks about OPEC, and he talks about CERT, and he talked about all these energy resources tribes throughout our country, the native tribes that weren't being taken seriously by the federal government. All of this he talked about in terms of what it meant in terms of economic development. He mentioned that for sure, Navajo Nation government should not be in charge of the majority of what small businesses or even businesses, that they should be in charge of only certain types of businesses where there needs to be this oversight, which are those natural resources, the energy resources, whether it's coal, petroleum, uranium, those large entities. But the majority of what makes a community, what makes environments successful are our small businesses. At least 80% support needs to go to help grow small businesses. And that's not what's happening right now in the Navajo Nation. It is so difficult because we want to be successful, but if we're not in an environment that will help us be successful, then a lot of us are going to leave, unfortunately, which is a story of what happened in my case. I had lived in Southern Arizona for 18 years. I prepared myself in my craft. I worked with my best producers from PBS. I trained, I learned everything from grip to shooting to being a director in a studio. I did it all. And I wanted to come home and do something for the Navajo people, whether it's historic preservation and keeping those information alive. I traveled across Navajo Nation looking for a studio, didn't find anything. I found Navajo Nation Film Office and Broadcast Services, but they ended up not having up-to-date telecommunications. Their licenses failed. Currently, right now in the Navajo Nation, only one functioning studio, television studio, and that is at Shiprock IHS. And that's because they got support from the doctors to put an actual studio with edit bays and cameras, and they do their videos, but specifically only for health. That environment, if it's only available one place or another place and that's it, I had actually moved back and I tried to reside in Tuba City. In Tuba City, I loved being there. It's a quiet environment from the city. I love being around Shikado, Shidene. You know, it was really something to come home to see. The people at the sandwich shops making my sandwich were Navajos. They weren't other tribes. They weren't other races. They were from where I come from. And when you're away for a long time, you miss that. So I thought, okay, Tuba City will be that place. But when I had moved back, I had to regain new clients. How does this environment work? Because working outside the reservation, you know, I understood about contracts. I understood how to handle deposits. I understood how working with organizations and corporations worked. On Navajo, it's completely different. A lot of the departments are dependent on the Navajo Nation government. So it's all tied into a system. That system, which is bottlenecked with the 164 process. I don't know how many different levels of processes they have to get approvals from, 27 steps or something. Everybody, it bottlenecks every process you got. But I was able to generate a client. And as I was working, and what I do is I make commercials for companies. I make promotional videos, anything that will help market an organization, a company. The organization that I got a client as a client required this promo video. It was supposed to be 10 minutes. I put it together, I shot it, I went out there, got the audio, came back, started editing. Now here's the upload issue. In my field of what I do requires a lot of technology. Very important to have the computer, very important to have strong internet. And of course, if you're on any part of the Navajo Nation, you'll see these little signs by every junction road that says high-speed internet. And they tell you, oh, we have this, whether if it's through Choice Wireless or if it's through Cellular One, high speed, and it's kind of a joke. What I dealt with in terms of high speed was 10 years ago. It's interesting that today I had my relatives that still live out there. I asked them to do a speed test. And if anybody hasn't done a speed test, you should learn what internet is about. You can say high speed and don't believe that that's exactly what it is. Investigate why an upload number is important and why a download number isn't important. And then how many people are on your system. Those numbers are so important. And back then when I was in Tuba City, the number of a download, which means when you're at YouTube or you're at Netflix and you're downloading a movie, how long it takes for that movie to come down. The rate at the time I think I was dealing with was, and we tried to get the highest because that was what I was needing. I think it was 4 megabytes per second. I think that was the highest I could ever get. And we kept tugging with them as much as we could. That was back then. And then the upload though was the problem, because in order for me on my end to upload a video to a client takes about, takes a lot of megabytes per second. But what was allocated to me as a household, I think at most it was only 1 megabyte per second. What that means and what that translates to is a 2 to 3 minute video took me in Tuba City 8 to 10 hours to upload. That's a lot of wear and tear on your hardware for it to be moving and trying to push information out. So that determination, after it kept happening, I could not wait. I mean, that impacts how I do business, how I deal with getting my deadlines met. It changed everything. So that meant that over time, I could not sustain living in an environment like that, because this is the work I was trained to do, to be in. I could easily have just left it all and perhaps become a school teacher and forget my dream and forget what it is that I love to do and passionately. But I didn't. I kept at it, but it forced me actually to then leave the Navajo Nation again. I left to live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I had to weigh the pros and cons. I could have gone further back down to Tucson and live further away. I could live in Phoenix, which is a little bit more crowded, but my purpose was to come back and to speak about our Navajo issues and to record and to document. But the closest I could be was Flagstaff. And it turned out Flagstaff is the second highest cost of living in the state. It's terrible, but it also meant that, all right, I'm going to pay every high tax to live here, and I'm going to pay everything high cost of living that it takes to live here so I can be closer to home. My internet is amazing, of course. And so when we talk about speed, my download speed currently today is 189 megabytes per second. My upload is 28, almost 30 megabytes per second, compared to, which I still ask my cousin, what is it today that she's using in Tuba City? Currently in Tuba City, the average for her household download speed is 0.74 megabytes per second, and the upload is 0.35 megabytes per second. And people are sharing. So when you're sharing on a wireless, it gets weaker and weaker. It's awful. That is what's creating this whole digital divide. It's creating our education system to falter back. Our young people right now, everyone's in the pandemic going to online schooling. What are we supposed to do? There's a lot of problems and complications, and I apologize if I'm speaking too long on this. It's tell me when to cut off or time out or butt in. But it's those complications. I guess the last thing I have to say about it is it makes me sad, because the Navajo Nation government at this point is saying, okay, you know, we gave you guys in my generation all these scholarships, Manuelito, Chief Manuelito. We told you to go get an education, go away, you know, and come back and bring your information back. I did. And instead they took my ladder away, if you want to say it that way. They did not provide for a lot of us to come back and have something to come back to. The housing is awful. There's no community law enforcement. We're low on all kinds of things. Trash pickup goes on and on. It just something happened in history where a lot of balls, the balls were dropped and nobody decided to really address the serious issues, because it takes work. And I don't think a lot of people want to do the work sometimes, but you know what? A lot of the young people, we need to instill in them, we're here, the people who do care, who can tell you what's happening. We need to change it for the future to exist in the next 20 years. If not, it's again, back up to them. So not happy to be living here in Flagstaff, but I also don't have a home site lease on Navajo. And if I go over there next week, it's not going to be any different. I still have to be here.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think you have several people on this call, just looking at the name, who can empathize. I was drinking out of my Chief Manuelito mug this morning, my hot chocolate. And I completely empathize with that story. I feel the same. I would love to go home, but instead I'm here in Colorado because I don't feel that there's a place for me anymore. I feel like I educated myself out by doing exactly what the tribe told me to do. So Shirley, since you also are interim ED at Native Women Entrepreneurs of Arizona, I imagine that many of your members have either established a business on tribal lands, or they share your story of leaving their communities in order to grow their business. I'm just curious, what are some of the themes that you see as barriers to growth in tribal communities, specifically for small business owners? So we talked about a few of them, but from your members' perspective, what are the sorts of things that you're hearing?
You know, it's heartbreaking to hear at the very beginning, 3 years ago when we started NWEAZ, a lot of us didn't have a network to go to. Our search was to try to identify women who were already in business, so we could have a dialogue, a discussion of how things are going. We started off actually with a lot of women that were already in an urban setting in the Phoenix area, which is very different than the women who come from a rural community area. Two different types of responses. Just like there's two different ways of how to do business on the reservation and off, and there are a lot of people in positions of leadership who don't know that there's that huge difference. Going back to your statistic about the, or your data about taxes, the number one reason I am not registered on the Navajo Nation, just going back to that question, is there is no IRS tax type of system to at least have a transparency of where my tax dollars are going to go if I chose to register back with Navajo Nation. I don't live there. I get my services and my trash is picked out here. So why am I going to reinvest this money, but I don't know where it's going to go? If it's not, our roads should be completely better than where they are. Communities are chapter houses, but again, we're dealing with a whole gap of people that of leadership ability and of an education that in every community, it's pretty bad right now. So the women coming from the urban environments, again, have different challenges. They're very, they also see a lack of resources available for them. Even the social connection of exchanging information. How did you do this? Or who's your accountant? Or, you know, what is your industry? Then you have the women up here on Navajo or in any rural part of the state of Arizona. Native Women Entrepreneurs of Arizona actually caters to all the 22 tribes in the state of Arizona. Our hope is to cater to all 22 tribes because we would love to have all of the tribes represented, every woman represent from a tribe. And we found that that is a difficulty. Our state is so vast. It's not like New Mexico where everyone's concentrated in northern New Mexico and pueblos and all the tribes are together. It's pretty tight knit and that's strong. But for Arizona, we're from way north to way south and then on both sides. It's not easy to try to communicate a message and get everybody together, but we're trying. A few years ago, actually last year, NWEAZ did an informal survey. And it was our first attempt to understand data also. What data do we have that we can start looking at? How many entrepreneurs are here in this state? What we found out from that was the number one industry of a lot of Native Americans who took that survey were from the arts and crafts industry. Very much, it's heavily, we all do it. You know, we all have had ourselves, whether we've made jewelry with our families, that kind of been passed down to us in our lineage. It's one of those industries that we're all very good at doing, especially with the tribal communities in the state. The state actually receives a high percentage of the tax dollars because visitors come to the state because of tourism to see Native American tribes. And those Native American tribes then use that as that mechanism to help sell a product. So that's why we have these high concentrated areas of vendors. So the vendors of this vendor, and we have this gray economy, and we have other types of industries which are different again out of the urban areas. So it really depends on who we're talking about, but there are multiple environments of who we're talking about business, because it's not all the same.
Right.
So your question about some of the ladies, what they've encountered, I'm not sure if you want to talk more about the women that are trying to do business back on Navajo, or the Navajos that live in the urban areas doing business still.
That is a good question. And actually, I did want to talk about the gray economy or the informal economy a little bit later on too. So for now, I guess I'm mostly curious about people in the urban areas, because I know, well, also because I resonate with them. I now live in an urban area and I would love to go back home. But the logistics of actually doing that and trying to run a business, I'm not sure how to navigate that. So I assume that that's a common story. I don't think I'm alone in that. In fact, I know you and I are similar in that. So is that a theme that you see amongst a lot of urban Native women? Do they want to go home, and are they seeing what sort of barriers are they seeing to that?
It's everything that we're talking about right now. The biggest thing is the internet. That component alone is changing business. It is so it's so becoming so dependent in a lot of our professions. You know, I heard a lot from all of our small businesses in the urban environments that would love to come home, but again, that movement of business is it's faster and it's more convenient, and things just get done in a week or two, less than a week or two. When you come back home, I mean, we're dealing, whether if it's those PO boxes, people can't get their shipments to them, they can't receive supplies in time. We don't have a UPS component. We have the trucks that drive around on these dirt roads, or they have these stops, but it's not like you have a UPS store on the corner that you could go to. All those things impact that business component. So again, what I see is that this discussion that we're having is absolutely needed, and it needs to happen constantly, because if you don't just have it one time or one here and one there, it's not going to work. It's our people, the young people, that need to hear it over and over and over. You can't just say it one time. You got to keep going on and on and on. And it's not us that we're going to be able to come back, to tell you the truth. I don't think in my lifetime I will actually go back to Navajo Nation and be able to function doing what I do, because there's so much work that still needs to be made. The infrastructure still needs to be built. But what we can do, again, is provide that information for our next generations to be there. We could help our next generations to do it, to get them to have a better place than where we were, where we are.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
I think, well, I know other ladies who share that perspective too, that these are generational shifts and that we should think of all these changes as changes for our children. So on that theme, I want to switch gears a little bit and focus on the legal environment, since our research indicates it's one of the most highly problematic scenarios for Native entrepreneurs. So Colin, you've spent years representing Navajo businesses in the court system. I'm just curious, do our findings on the time requirement and expense for legal action, do they match your experience?
Hey, thanks, Heather, and Ms. Francis. That was very inspiring talk. It's, unfortunately, a very common situation. And so, te bene. Well, here in Phoenix, it's 2 minutes left for that. So I'm Colin Bradley. It's nice to meet everyone and see everyone virtually on this discussion. And thanks you guys for the great presentation earlier. It's been it's fascinating research, and unfortunately, it is reflective of the process of how long it takes cases to go through, and the costs associated, like it in thing that those types of findings. And I guess one of the major reasons, and I'm not trying to be on too tangential with my discussion, and I'm trying to focus it on kind of what we've seen, but just sort of after listening to the presentation and thinking about the issues, one of the main things that I think contributes to this problem that we've seen about how long it takes and how much it is to enforce a contract is, so for example, in Arizona, if you have any dispute that's even arising under a contract and you have to sue someone about that, the party that loses that case has to pay the other party's entire attorney's fees if they have to go to court for that dispute. And so that is the complete opposite of the Navajo Nation, where there's through the common law, through the courts, it's the presumption that each party bears their own costs about bringing suit. And unfortunately, like the example we saw earlier, even if you sue someone and you're successful, you still have to pay your attorney's fees, but that's not an additional cost that you can recoup from the party who you're successful against. And so that's one of the, one of the biggest issues is that, in other places, for example, it would be a default that you would get that, but there, unfortunately, you do not. And so as a suggestion, a sort of way around that is the Navajo Nation courts have said that if it is in your contract, you can get that cost back. So if you are writing a contract, if you're doing business or something like that, you would want to make sure to include in there if there is some type of action that you would be able to recoup your fees for that, for having to sue them on that type of case. So that's just a general suggestion if that comes to if that is an issue for your business. And just thinking about other issues, as far as contracts go. So on the Navajo Nation, the courts have also stated that there's because words are sacred, never frivolous in Navajo culture, there's also the ability on the Navajo Nation to have oral contracts. And so that's, different from certain other places where, there's a prohibition on oral contracts. And one of the reasons for that is because there's something called the statute of frauds, which essentially means that if there is a case that's over or a contract for a certain value, it has to be written down. And so before on the Navajo Nation, that there was no such thing as the statute of frauds. Like you could have essentially an oral contract for any type of thing at all. Like it didn't matter how much its value was. But there actually is a Navajo Uniform Commercial Code. And so I'd imagine for a lot of you guys, for the entrepreneurs, if you are creating a contract about a business on the Navajo Nation, that might be something that you want to look into, because there is about the sales of goods and things like that. There are sort of these default provisions in the Navajo Uniform Commercial Code. And one of them has to do, with the statute of frauds. And so essentially, if you're selling something that's over, I believe it's $500, there should be a contract that's supposed to be in writing. There's an exception for that on the Navajo Nation for bartering. And so, kind of if you're going back and forth about the value of something, they've taken that provision out. And so you are allowed to do that. And then, there is just trying to think about, other things that would be helpful for you guys. If there is a dispute that's less than $2,000, so if the goods that you're selling, if your contract where you sold something, if somebody made a purchase order from you and that was less than $2,000, you do have the option of going to small claims court on the Navajo Nation. And so it is less formal and it is supposed to be more streamlined. And so, it costs a little bit less money. I think the filing fee is, $10, but it's compared to, I think it's like $35 or $40 for a normal case. So the cost of filing isn't significantly different, but it's supposed to be, more streamlined. I believe the hearing is supposed to be in 50 days and things like that. So, if you don't want to go through the whole process of, and you are able to afford, and you can't hire an attorney, something like that, you do have that option of going to small claims court. One of the problems as well on the Navajo Nation is that the courts have essentially stated that if you are a business, if you are a corporation or something like that, you have to be represented by an attorney, because as a fictional entity, they've stated that a business or some type of corporation would have to appear in court with an attorney with representation. So that's something to consider as well. So if you are suing somebody on behalf of your company, you would have to have an attorney in that instance. And so these are just some of the things that come to mind just from the presentation. And I'm not trying to go too far off on that. But as far as the timeframes go and the costs of suit, those all, unfortunately sound like the reality on the ground on the Navajo Nation, because it does take a long time. And I believe that a lot of that probably has to do with the lack of segregation in levels of courts. So while you can, there's sort of Navajo Nation, there's small claims court, and then there's everything else for businesses. But, a difference for that, for example, here in Arizona is, there are specific courts for more complex civil litigation. So, there are certain cases where it would be designated, more complex. There's a lot more issues going on. There's contracts, things like that. And so there's sort of avenues for you to be steered into that direction. And then, the levels of the courts here. So there's, the highest sort of level is, as far as just the general civil court goes, is superior court. And so I believe it's, more than $10,000. So if your case, your dispute isn't even worth that much money, you can't even go through that process. And then another thing that happens in the court system down here is that if you are in superior court, you are required to go to mediation first. And so if you it's sort of all of these things are kind of like filtering mechanisms to kind of get disputes resolved earlier. And so a lot of those, sort of guidelines and sort of filters are not there on the Navajo dispute system. So unfortunately, that's why I would imagine a lot of these disputes take, a lot longer than they would in other places, because there isn't the different levels of courts. There isn't, binding mediation or mandatory mediation that you would have to go through first and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it just does seem accurate.
Awesome. And you actually just answered one of the follow-up questions I had about that, the time that it takes. But I want to ask a clarifying question about self-representation and corporations. So a lot of the businesses on Navajo in particular are sole proprietorships. Would they, as sole Ps, could they still self-represent, or is that specific to corporations, LLCs, and so on?
I would argue that they would just be able to represent themselves if they are just the sole proprietor, because I think that the whole idea is that it comes from the legal fiction that there's an entirely separate entity. And so if you are, a sole proprietor, there is no legal distinction between you and the business. So I would say that you would be able to.
Okay. I want to also understand, because I don't come from a legal mind, if there's room for change, and if so, what that looks like. So many of the barriers related to starting, operating, and growing a business on Navajo have a chicken and egg theme. Do we need more entrepreneurs in order to make change happen, or do the changes to the business regulatory, or do we make the changes to the business regulatory environment in order to see more entrepreneurs on Navajo? And I hear the argument all the time that there are, quote, not any businesses on Navajo, so why should our leaders prioritize regulatory change? Well, without change to the regulatory environment, you guarantee that most Navajo businesses remain invisible. They're operating from home, they don't register their business, and they therefore don't pay business taxes. So I'm going off on a tangent, but I swear I'm going to come back. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with the term gray economy that Cheryl used earlier, also called the informal economy, it refers to economic activity that is not regulated or protected by the state. So small, unregistered businesses like what you would find in the flea market or on the roadside and so on. And President Nez has previously stated that we have a 50% unemployment rate, which suggests to me that the Navajo Nation probably has a pretty significant informal economy. And when I drive across the res, when I'm in Tuba City, I get the sense of that too. We have thriving flea markets, small farmers markets, and lots of roadside vending. It also suggests to me that there's probably a pretty high number of entrepreneurs and business owners all around the reservation. People selling Piccadilly, beaded jewelry, weaving rugs from their home, or selling coal from their trucks. And that collectively, we're a very large community of entrepreneurs, likely in the tens of thousands. So Colin, that was a long-winded way of getting back to you. I'm so curious from your perspective, should this community of entrepreneurs rely on a Navajo court system as it is and hope that it changes as our numbers grow? Or does the court system need to be fixed first before we can see a better community or growing community of entrepreneurs? I just want to get your feedback on how you think that change happens.
So that's an interesting question. And I think, from, I guess not specifically focusing on the court, but more from a regulatory standpoint. So, there are sort of issues that, you would run into on the Navajo Nation. And, when you're talking about no businesses being there, One of the examples of that is I believe it's the Navajo Nation Consumer Protection Act. And so that act was, I believe it was passed so it says here 1999. And so what that act did was actually impose a lot of regulations on businesses that were not previously there. And so, if you look at the act, a lot of it has to do with preventing, pyramid schemes, taking advantage of people and things like that. But from what I understand, some of the unintended consequences of that, because there are a lot of provisions about pawn shops and about auto dealerships. And so, and about repossessing cars and things like that. And so once these regulations, are put in place, essentially, one of the unintended consequences of it is that there are a lot of businesses that either cannot or do not want to comply with these laws anymore. And so you have to ask yourself, if this law, the protecting of the consumers and imposing these regulations is worth, not having essentially any car dealerships on the reservation anymore. There aren't really any, pawn shops that are on the reservation anymore, even though a lot of people, they just go across, to the border towns to get those services. So, I mean, there's a, bunch of car dealerships, for example, in Flagstaff, there's a bunch in Gallup, things like that where, and, with pawn shops as well, so, I mean, it didn't necessarily stop people from using those businesses. It just changed where they go for them. So you as example for Ms. Francis, I mean, she did not stop her business, but unfortunately it was, because of the business environment, she just had to relocate somewhere else. And so I think, as far as some of these overarching regulations, you have to think of, is the cure better than, the harm that was going into it? And for some people, they would say, yes, that is. And so that's more of a policy discussion, I guess, but there are, regulations like that are less, I guess, business friendly, you could think, than are in other places. And so I think, as there are more entrepreneurs, as there are people who want to sort of step in those shoes and start their own businesses, I think that is the point where, they end up talking to their council delegate, they end up having, some type of lobbying group. So, I mean, for example, like I am my business, I'm a member of NFIB, which is, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And so, for example, on the Navajo Nation, I heard about the Chamber of Commerce on here before, so there are, and obviously like Change Labs, there are groups that are spewing, those changes. And unfortunately, sometimes those changes are more policy than they are anything else. And so that's kind of, where a lot of that change does have to go.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I want to pick up on that thread near the end, but I also recognize that it's now about 1:15 Navajo time, and I want to leave some time for our audience to ask any burning questions that they have. And then I also see that Mr. Redhouse has posted his Google speed test, and I'm going to respond to that now, but unfortunately that is pretty poor internet speeds. Again, Shirley's numbers it was 128 and something else, can't remember, but.
The upload is 28.81 megabytes per second, so almost 30 megabytes per second, with a download of 189 megabytes per second. Okay. And why that's important is it's fast. That's fast in terms of delivery of technology. When you have a system like what Mr. Redhouse has for 1.23 megabytes for a download and a 0.37 for an upload, I mean, you're talking about information. It depends if you're sharing this on a shared wireless or other people on it. It makes information go slow. You have a lot of pixelation. You have a lot of issues, basically, where information isn't moving fast.
Right. Context matters there. Change Labs, side note, has a great IT firm that we work with, Navajo owned, in Gallup. If any of you want to chat with Joe Elliott Nez about improving your internet speeds on Navajo. Okay, now for audience questions. Are there any questions for Shirley, for Colin, or for Causal Design? You could go ahead and type your questions in the chat window or unmute yourself and introduce yourself to us.
Hi, everybody. This is Jessica Stego. Thanks for coming or for logging on. She Jessica Stego and Shep Agnishle does of Gabashichin, Kia Ani Deshache does of Gandashanala. I work for Change Labs as well as the business director of business incubation. And I had a question for Colin. We talked about businesses that were in some sort of dispute with another business. Do you have any advice? And I think what you said was really good advice, but do you have any advice for businesses who are in a dispute with the tribe in terms of payments? Over the years, we've had several, I've had several businesses that never were able to get payment from the tribe, and it usually has something to do with the process, the procurement process, in which the tribe's manager did not follow the right process, and so then OMB or accounts receivable refuses to pay, and so they just kind of get stuck in between this, in this place where the superior department will not pay, but the lower level managers don't have any power to do anything about it, even though it was their mistake. And of course, I'm generalizing a lot there. So anyway, do you have any advice for anybody in that type of situation?
So I guess for that specific type of situation, I would just avoid in my instance of giving any specific advice, because as Heather said, I used to work there, so I don't want to tell you this is what you should do in that situation. But just generally, I think a lot of the issues come down to communication, and essentially what I was discussing before. I think the best advice for really anyone that has, any type of business there is to have everything in writing. And I think a lot of, the issues that you may or may not be discussing have to do with, sort of discussions that may have occurred, outside of that. So when you're saying, they talked to somebody who was this supervisor, they weren't somebody who was actually in charge. If you God forbid you are going to go to court on that, that is just something that would be hard to keep track of. And if you're trying to present evidence of that, and you say I spoke to this person, but they weren't really in charge, that is kind of bringing it back to exactly why you would want to have everything in writing about the terms of what you would be doing and how that would be enforced. And because you never want to be in a situation where you've spent a lot of money on something, and you don't really have a mechanism to enforce that. And so I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about it earlier when you guys were talking about the research about enforcing judgments. That is a totally separate discussion, and it's it is a real problem on the Navajo Nation, because a lot of the times, even if you sue somebody and you win, the question becomes, how do you collect on that judgment? What type of assets can you get from that person? And unfortunately, on the Navajo Nation, a lot of the people are basically, judgment proof, because of the way that the courts have interpreted, types of judgments is, you have to leave somebody's motor vehicle. Like if they only have one car, you can't collect that car from them. You're not allowed to collect on their house, their home site lease, things like that. So those are automatically, kind of taking away some of the biggest portions. If you won a lawsuit where anywhere else, you would be able to get a lien on somebody's house, you would probably be able to seize, their assets, like their cars and things like that. But, there on the Navajo Nation, like if you can't put a lien on somebody's house after you like a $30,000 judgment on them, unless they have that cash, or they have a bunch of really valuable items besides their car and their house sitting around, You know, if, I mean, I guess they would have to have that in their bank account, but, you know, that's a, you know, not to get too far off, but that's, you know, one of the other biggest issues as well, is just collecting on a judgment, even if you get it.
Any other questions for our guests? Ah, here's one from Carmela. Do you have any publications or research that is available for the public? I think this might be maybe a question for Change Labs, for NWEAZ, and also for Colin. So I'll let all of us speak to this question. Shirley, I'm going to direct it to you first to see if your organization has any publications or research on these issues that are available to the public.
We are still, we are still working in putting that together. We do. And in fact, we presented, if anybody has attended our NWEAZ work sessions, we've provided that information to our business owners. They have a look-see on what that informal survey we did last summer was about, what it looks like. So as far as we start to continue our foundation, our growth, I'm sure we'll find that spot somewhere on our website.
And I am posting in the chat window now the link to Change Labs research that we're sharing today on the state of doing business on the Navajo Nation. And it's more than just enforcing contracts and tax payments. The research that we've done speaks to that whole ecosystem that that Hannah shared a little bit earlier. And of course, that's all public data now. If anybody wants to use that for their own purposes or just to as a framework for talking about the challenges of entrepreneurship, you should feel free to use any of our findings for your own purposes. And then Colin, I'll turn it over to you. Do you know of any publications or research on these topics that might be helpful for Navajo entrepreneurs?
You know, I'm not sure if it's helpful or not, or if it's even, you know, necessarily relevant, but you know, just as far as publications, you know, I did publish something recently in the Arizona State Bar magazine, and it's called From Jerusalem to Window Rock. And essentially what it is it's talking about policies that they have implemented in Israel that have been successful to sort of economic development and bringing members back home that I think would be helpful for Indian tribes to implement. So I don't know if that would be helpful to you in your life or interesting, but you know, I do think there are, you know, certain things that they have done there that would be helpful for Indian tribes. So for example, there's the law of return there that states, you know, Jewish people essentially around the world can be granted citizenship in Israel. And so if you want to, you know, you would be able to move back there. They have entire departments. So for example, like the Ministry of Aliyah. So it's for all the people who do want to make that return to Israel. There's essentially an office, you know, which fills a gap, kind of what we're talking about, where they help people integrate back into society there. They help them start businesses. They have language immersion classes and things like that. And so those are just some of the, you know, the ideas, you know, sort of, I guess, more policy-wise, thinking out loud. But, you know, besides that, I don't know if I have, if that's helpful to you at all.
Actually would really love to read that. I could see a whole return to Navajo department that assists with some of these things. That's wonderful. Thank you. Are there any other questions for our guests?
Heather, could I make a comment?
Absolutely.
We're about ready to go. The message, as a small business owner, I'm the owner of CF Productions LLC. I own a video audio production company off the reservation. I think the message for a lot of our entrepreneurs and business owners that do business in rural communities, in tribal communities, if anything, it is not easy to be a business owner. I think that the number one rule everybody should understand is being a business owner, you are solely, it's a risk. You are solely responsible for everything that you're doing, whether if it's your insurance, your bookkeeping, finding a lawyer. Those are all really important things to have in your pocket. Also, that realization that we do not have a W-2 that we collect. We have our own system. We either collect 1099s, and you learn all these different numbers and acronyms and names. It's a lot of responsibility. So, and I think that feeds into, again, that mechanism of why we have a gray economy. There's so much trust that our communities don't have, simply because of our history with the federal government. It's so difficult to change the minds of individuals when there's been so many not successful things happen for us. That feeds into every generation. Mr. Bowley was talking about just a moment ago about these different schools in different countries, and I always wondered why even our own Navajo Nation doesn't have an after-school program that's called Navajo School or something. Like the Jewish communities, they end up investing in their own communities so that they can sustain their language and culture, and it's not within the actual education system, but that's how they survive. That's not happening for Navajo. So we're losing a lot of that. And it's that effort from those other communities that are doing it that you can see there's some things that work. And are we able to even try that? Or can even a community decide to do that? And it just, again, takes the effort and the work of people to do it. If they do not, then we're going to go down this road, this trajectory of always being this way. But that's pretty difficult to swallow also, because it's going to come to a point, if we don't start using what we have, we could lose that. If you don't use it, you lose it type of a theme. And we always have eyes looking at our tribal communities, at our lands. And if that's what the people want, if they don't want to change it and work it and help influence that next generation, that's what's going to happen. But again, thank you so much, Change Labs, for this conversation. It can go on and on, but
It really can. So the last thing I want to add, and then we can sign off. And of course, if anybody has any questions, just throw them into the chat window and I can interrupt myself to ask your questions, is that, you know, what are we doing with this research now that we've done all this work? And like Shirley says, this can't just be one conversation. This needs to be a series of conversations. And I think we at Change Labs fervently agree with that statement. So I can share, at the moment, we are working with the Navajo Nation Division of Economic Development, building a community of stakeholders that can put forward policy recommendations around the business regulatory environment that speak directly to some of the issues that came out of our research, but also just some of the broader issues that weren't covered by the World Bank methodology, like internet connectivity and the lack of physical addresses and so on. There's so much work to be done to make it easier to be a Navajo business owner back home on Navajo. And as Shirley says, this is generational work that needs to be done. But I just wanted to share with you all what Change Labs foresees as the next step of this research. And we're looking forward to engaging a number of stakeholders, likely including our partners at NWEAZ, Dene Chamber of Commerce, American Indian Chamber of Commerce of Arizona, and so on. So to close this out, because I know we're about to lose people, we're almost at 1:30 Navajo now. There are two ways that we are asking audience members to support Native entrepreneurs over the next few months. First and foremost, Change Labs has a petition going on right now asking our congressional leaders to clean up a lot of the vacant and contaminated federal buildings that are occupying our communities. On the screen in front of you is one of the most beautiful and prominent buildings in Tuba City that has been sitting vacant like this for years. And there's several buildings right across the street from it. Beautiful buildings occupying prime real estate on Main Street that are contaminated with asbestos. And the first step is federal cleanup before those buildings can be released back to communities or reused or repurposed in any way. So we're asking for support from our community to sign this petition, asking our local congressmen to request congressional funds to clean up these buildings. So if this is a cause that you can support, I've put a link in the chat window to our petition. And we're trying to collect 5,000 signatures by the end of this month, September. And then finally, buying Navajo, buying Native is something that we can all do. And Change Labs is trying to make that easier by creating a digital database of Native American businesses, small businesses across the Southwest. If you go to resrising.org, do a little bit of your Christmas shopping there with vendors that you find The next time you need a plumbing service, check Res Rising to see if there's a Native-owned plumber in your community. It's a great way to find and learn about new Native-owned small businesses. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, this was our final discussion of our 4-part series, Doing Business on the Navajo Nation. We're looking specifically at the challenges of growing a small business. Thank you again for joining us. You can come visit us in Tuba City anytime, and we hope to see you all again. Thank you.